Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the University of Michigan. I'm Lori McCauley, Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs, and it's just really nice to see everyone. There's a great vibe in the room, and I know we're going to have an awesome panel. It's a privilege, really, to welcome you to the university and this historic gathering, the special panel on the future of Ukraine, organized by the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia in partnership with the Atlantic Council and co-sponsored by the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. Today we come together to explore pressing questions and challenges that will shape the future of Ukraine and impact global stability for years to come. First, I'd like to welcome and thank Regent Ron Weiser for being here, for being a champion of this undertaking, also just for being a great friend and partner for the university. Thank you. Also, I would like to offer gratitude to the Atlantic Council, represented by Ambassador Dan Freed and Ambassador John Herbst. Thank you as well. This collaboration exemplifies what we strive to do here at the university, and that is bridge scholarly insight with real-world impact. Our goal is not only to study these issues, but to actively participate in shaping a better future. I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, led by its director, Geneviève Zubrzycki. Thank you for your leadership. The Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia has made its mark since 2008 in strengthening research and scholarship in the region and has met the moment in supporting Ukrainian scholars and civil society since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. The University of Michigan has a long-standing tradition of engaging with the world's most urgent issues. Through initiatives like this, we aim to foster a deeper understanding and to cultivate productive dialogue, as well as, critically today, provide recommendations for the new U.S. administration for a just future. The topics we face today are complex and challenging. Ukraine's journey, its quest for stability, sovereignty, and a secure future resonates with all of us who value freedom and democracy. The discussions ahead will span many disciplines, reflecting the interconnected nature of political stability, economic development, security, and human rights. Our university community cares deeply about these issues, and I'm proud of the work leading up to this event, which brought together voices from diverse backgrounds and deep thinkings on this critical subject. Together, we can better understand the nuances of Ukraine's path forward and the implications for Europe and the world. This symposium is not only an opportunity to learn, but represents the creation of new ideas and solutions that will inspire action. Given the roster of world-renowned participants and their deep policy expertise, I'm sure the sessions they've already completed over the last 2 days have been fruitful. Thank you all again for joining us here today. I hope these outcomes move the hearts and minds and honor the resilience and the courage of the people of Ukraine. And with that, I would like to invite Professor Geneviève Zubrzycki, our director of the WCEE, to introduce our panelists. Professor.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. It means a lot to us to be able to host such a symposium with such distinguished guests and to present the result of two intense days of discussions on pointed topics. For me, it's been an amazing experience to witness diplomacy and public policy making as it was coming out, basically, as it was emerging among participants. So for the past 2 days in this very room, 16 diplomats, policymakers, deep thinkers, and leaders from Ukraine, EU member states, the UK, and the US have been working to create recommendations for the incoming US administration for a just and sustainable future in Ukraine. We started planning this event with a very short window. We wanted to gather together those thinkers after the presidential elections, but before the next administration would take power on January 20th. This was, between basically November 5th and the end of our semester. A very brief window, and we were extremely pleased to have so many distinguished guests accepting our invitation. So our hope is that the work will have an impact far beyond these walls. The symposium and this special panel are emblematic of what we strive to achieve at the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, that is an understanding of and a deep engagement with our region. We could not have done it without the participation and the partnership of the Atlantic Council, represented here by Ambassadors Dan Fried and John Herbst. So I'm very deeply grateful to them, and also to Regent Ron Weiser and the Honorable Eileen Weiser for establishing the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia in 2008, and for their continued and steadfast support. So thank you again. And I know I'm repeating what Provost Macaulay said, but those thanks are coming from the bottom of my heart. So this evening, we're pleased to present you with the group's findings and a discussion with 5 participants. Q&A will follow the panel, and we have provided on your seats note cards and pencils. These are for you to actually write legibly, if you can, as legibly as possible, brief questions that then 2 U of M students will pose to the panelists. We will collect them periodically during the event. The discussion will be moderated by Ambassador Fried, the Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. In the course of his 40-year foreign service career, Ambassador Fried played a key role in designing and implementing American policy in Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. As Special Assistant and NSC Senior Director for Presidents Clinton and Bush, Ambassador to Poland between 1997 to 2000, and as Assistant Secretary of State for Europe between 2005 and 2009, Ambassador Fried helped craft the policy of NATO enlargement, to Central European nations, and in parallel, NATO-Russia relations, thus advancing the goal of Europe whole, free, and at peace. Ambassador Fried also helped lead the West's response to Moscow's aggression against Ukraine starting in 2014. As State Department Coordinator for Sanctions Policy, he crafted U.S. sanctions against Russia, the largest U.S. sanctions program to date, and negotiated the imposition of similar sanctions by Europe, Canada, Japan, and Australia. Ambassador Fried will be joined in conversation by the following distinguished speakers. Dmytro Kuleba served as Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine from March 2020 until just this last September. So 4 eventful years while leading Ukraine's foreign service through its most challenging times during Russian aggression. Minister Kuleba played a key role in building alliances, securing arms, imposing sanctions, advancing Ukraine's EU and NATO's bids, and expanding ties with Africa, Asia, and Latin America. He has met with most major world leaders to further the need for Ukraine's defense and the need for international support, both political and pragmatic. Stephen Biegun has more than 3 decades of international affairs experience in government and in the private sector, including high-level government service with the Department of State, the White House, and the United States Congress. In 2021, Biegun concluded his most recent government service as the Deputy Secretary of State, to which he was confirmed by the Senate with a strong bipartisan vote of 90-3. Biegun began his career as a foreign policy specialist with the U.S. Congress, with a focus on Russia, the former Soviet Union, and Europe. He was Chief of Staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the National Security Advisor to Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist. He served 2 years as Executive Secretary of the White House National Security Council, as an advisor and deputy to National Security Advisor Condi Rice. Last but not least, he graduated from the U of M with a Bachelor of Arts in Russian language and political science, and he also recently served as the Weiser International Policymaker in Residence at the Ford School's Weiser Diplomacy Center. Last but not least, Assia Ivantcheva is the Senior Director for the European Program at the National Endowment for Democracy. She brings 20 years of experience working in democracy and human rights around the world, with a focus on Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Prior to joining NED, Dr. Ivantcheva was a Foreign Service officer with USAID, leading teams during turbulent political transitions and crises, including in Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Serbia, and Montenegro. As senior advisor with the elections and political transitions divisions at USAID, she worked on political transitions in several continents. Oh, and Minna. So Assia was not last but not least. Minna is coming last, but certainly not least. She's a research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and she's also a non-resident fellow with the Transatlantic Defense and Security Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis. She specializes in Northern European security and Nordic Defense Cooperation, as well as German foreign and security policy. And currently, she focuses on the implications of Finland and Sweden's recent NATO membership. So I want to thank all of you for serving on this panel, and to all of our distinguished participants to these two-day discussions at a symposium. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ambassador John Herbst, who will present the recommendations. Ambassador John Herbst is a senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. He served for 31 years as Foreign Service Officer in the U.S. Department of State. He was U.S. Ambassador to Uzbekistan from 2000 to 2003, and to Ukraine from 2003 to 2006. He most recently served as Director of the Center for Complex Operations at the National Defense University. He has received 2 Presidential Distinguished Service Awards, the Secretary of State's Career Achievement Award, the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award, and the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff Distinguished Civilian Service Award. Thank you, Ambassador Herbst, for your participation and leadership, and I now turn the floor to you.
Good evening. We've just spent, 18, 20 hours of intense conversation regarding the subject of tonight's conversation. I will tell you who participated in that at the end of my brief remarks. I will not go into the recommendations themselves because you have them on your seat, so there's no reason for me to do that. But let me explain the context, because the context is really important. We face today, we the United States, but also the global community, faces today the greatest challenge to our security, to our peace, and to our prosperity since, at a minimum, the end of the Cold War. That challenge is the rise of ever more provocative, and provocative is actually a kind word, behavior by 4 powers, 2 large and 2 intermediate. China, the greatest threat because it has a real economy and the second largest population in the world. Russia, the largest power in terms of physical space, although not. Okay, it works. Okay. The problem is me, not the microphone. All right. Russia, the largest power in terms of territory, but with an infinite taste for more. And of course, the only peer nuclear power to the United States. North Korea, a nuclear middle power with a definite taste for provocation. And Iran, about whom the same can be said, except it is not yet, and with some stronger power policy, will not be a nuclear power. And they are working in tandem. Putin calls the United States its principal adversary. The other three countries feel the same way. And as a noted historian and former senior State Department official, Philip Zelikow has written, the cooperation among these four powers today is greater than the cooperation among the three Axis powers, Japan, Nazi Germany, and Mussolini's Italy, up until 1941. The absolute epicenter of this quartet's aggression is Ukraine. So the title of today's conversation, The Future of Ukraine, could actually be the title of the future of Ukraine, Europe, the United States, and the world. Because we have a pressing interest, a vital interest, in making sure that this motley crew turns away from aggression. And the place to do that is in Ukraine. So, we gathered a group of eminent former officials and experts to talk about this for, again, 18 or so hours. And you have a distillation of all of that conversation, hundreds of thousands of words spoken, on your seat, one page, thanks to the creative efforts of Dan Fried, who you'll hear from later. We talked about three subjects. One was how to end Putin's aggression in Ukraine, which also takes into account, obviously, security arrangements in Europe and the NATO-Ukraine relationship. And the conversation will elaborate on that. Since reform in Ukraine is important to Ukraine's integration into the West, into the EU, and to NATO, we talked about reform, which involves, of course, a fairly stable democracy in Ukraine, but with serious problems of corruption. And then finally, we talked about the actual problem in Europe, which is not, quote unquote, the war in Ukraine, but a revanchist Russia, which launched that war. And the document you have on your seats largely talks about ending that war, the policy needed, especially in Washington, and the policy problem for the United States and its allies in dealing with, in a broad, to the larger sense, the quartet, but especially Russia. Because you defeat Putin in Ukraine, as Steve Biegun, from whom you'll hear later, says, every problem facing us around the world gets easier to solve. And that fundamental insight is not well understood in policy Washington. Okay, I'm done, except to tell you who participated in the conversation. That list will be out later, but it is not on your seat. You've heard some of the names already, but I'll just go down the list. Minna Ålander, who was introduced already. Stephen Biegun, who was introduced already. Ian Bond, a former British ambassador to Latvia. Dan Fried, who's already been introduced. Francois Heisburg, senior advisor for Europe at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Arisia Lucevich, the deputy director of the Russia-Arabia program at the Chatham House. Vladimir Milov, a research associate of the Wilfried Martin Center for European Studies, and importantly, a former deputy energy minister in the Russian Federation. Hrihory Nemiria, first deputy chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Parliament of Ukraine. Alina Polyakova, the president and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis. Bill Taylor, a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. And actually you already know Geneviève. So with that, I think Ron Weiser, to whom we all owe a debt of gratitude for making this possible, is going to say something to the audience, and I will hand him the microphone. Oh, he has his own microphone. as you would expect, an efficiently run organization. Oh, excuse me. My mistake. Yes, Slavomir Debsky, the President of Strategy and International Relations at the College of Europe and Ireland. And Slavomir, I owe you one. I owe you a beer in Warsaw.
I just wanted to take a second to thank these people for coming. I mean, these are preeminent people who've come from across the world to the University of Michigan, and the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia has a policy board, and about, I think it was September, if I'm not mistaken, we had a meeting, and we discussed the possibility of this, and of course, when we did, the timing was not exactly the best thing in the world, and without the efforts of Geneviève and Dan Fried, this could have never been put together, and this is really lightning speed to put a group together like this. And I can't think of any other place in the world other than the University of Michigan that could be a convener and attract this kind of talent. So what we've come up with here hopefully will help the new administration, help guide them as they try to go along some very, very difficult times that we face in the future. And especially want to thank Steve, who I've known for years and who's a Michigan alum and comes back and has helped not only here but also at the Ford School, for all the effort you've given back to the University of Michigan.
It's my place and privilege to be moderator of this group, and I'd like, you've seen the one-page recommendations, and you will make your own judgments as to their quality, but they came out, as John said, of intensive hours of discussion by people who are deeply committed to the cause of Ukraine's freedom, Europe's freedom, and the success of the free world against tyranny. And if I speak in such terms, it's because such terms are appropriate to where we find ourselves. And I'd like to ask Minister Kuleba, from Ukraine, years of experience. We met before you were foreign minister, and we've seen each other over the years. If you want to characterize the recommendations, that would be great, but also if you want to set up the context for where Ukraine finds itself now with the incoming Trump administration and the pressures that you're under of war and uncertainty, what you say is needed and your recommendations would be most welcome. So I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Dan. It's true. We first met when not only I was a young diplomat, but you were also a young diplomat. That was so many years ago. And you always were an inspiration in your willingness to understand our part of Europe and to help us to return to the West. Your contribution to this will always be remembered. Of course, my gratitude goes to the University of Michigan and each and every person who was involved in making it happen. Thank you for coming to listen to what we produced as a result of 2 intense days of discussions and drafting. I don't remember when was the last time that I was personally engaged in a drafting exercise. It was fun. But I think what we produced, I would describe it with one word: reasonable. This is the reasonable approach based on principles, and most importantly to me as Ukrainian, not based on the approach that peace should be achieved at the expense of Ukraine. Because this is the temptation that many decision makers have when they first and foremost ask themselves the question, what will Ukraine accept? what can Ukraine concede? And the fact that we shifted the focus, as Ambassador Herbst rightly said, and we make this emphasis that the problem is not the war in Ukraine, the problem is Russia, who waged this war, is a fundamental shift in conceptual understanding of how any further plans and decisions should be based. Second, I think it is fundamental that in this document we outline clearly that we recommend clearly that no concessions on the issue of territorial integrity should be made. And this policy is deeply rooted in the tradition of the US foreign policy, but I have more competent people in the room to talk about it, so I will stop here. Second, the idea that Ukraine can be neutralized or militarized is also defied in these recommendations. And finally, and to my mind, one of the most important elements in this policy recommendations is very simple. NATO membership of Ukraine is non-negotiable. This is not something that anyone should discuss with Russia. This is something that only Ukraine and allies, NATO allies, should discuss. The United States and other allies will sit down with Ukraine and discuss when and how membership should happen. But this is not something that Putin can bargain about. So these are the elements. There are many other important points, and trust me, the initial paper was 3 pages long, and we should credit Ambassador Fried, who invested his decades of diplomatic experience in shrinking the document to 1-pager at his own expense, because he skipped lunch. So that must be deeply appreciated. And speaking on the context, we are in the moment when Ukraine is tired, but it keeps fighting. And please make no mistake, it will. It will continue fighting. Because we in Ukraine realize how high stakes are. What we want to convey, in particular with this document, is the message that if Ukraine loses, the problems that the United States will be facing in the world will multiply dramatically. So whatever, sorry if I sound too blunt, but whatever the check of supporting Ukraine is, not only financially, but also politically and economically, the check of fixing the world, if Ukraine falls, will be much higher. And this is something that should be remembered. Russia is not at its best. Russia pretends it's winning, but it's not. And this is something that also has to be taken into account, and we understand that. We see it from many indicators. We see how we've observed how incentives for the incentives proposed by Russian government to Russian men to join the army skyrocket, which means one thing, that there is less and less people who are willing to die in Ukraine. Second, Russian economy faces some detrimental effects of both internal economic policies, but also the sanctions regime. And there's only one problem left. Putin wants to win at any cost. And we had a discussion whether really at any cost, or whether there is a certain limit that he cannot cross. But this is secondary. The most important thing is that we see escalation, and both sides, they keep fighting because they want to put themselves in the best position possible upon the arrival, until President Trump enters Oval Office. So what you've seen in the last weeks and what you're going to see in the weeks to follow will be, unfortunately, more fight, more destruction, more assaults, and more escalation. President Trump is an opportunity to end the war, and I'm deeply grateful, and I propose to view him from this perspective, and this is where I'll This is the assumption that our policy recommendations is based on. And this assumption was is my suggestion on how we should see further developments. The name of the seminar, The Future of Ukraine. So let me conclude by saying the future of Ukraine is bright, but the road to it will be twisting and bumpy. The more effective we are, the more committed we are, I mean all of us, the less casualties we will have on the way to the bright future. So thank you, all of you, for standing by the people of Ukraine while we are fighting.
Steve, 30 years ago, we were working, I was in the Clinton administration and you were a senior staffer in the Senate, and we were working together to overcome the legacy of the division of Europe and the Soviet Empire. And we're still engaged in the same issue 30 years later, under difficult conditions. You also served as Deputy Secretary for the first Trump administration. There's a lot of speculation and some news about how the Trump administration will approach Ukraine and Russia. And you were one of the leaders in putting together this paper. So what do you feel comfortable saying about that approach, and how should people look at it? Because there's a whole realm of speculation and concern and talk about it.
Thank you, Dan, and it's a great pleasure to be back here at my alma mater, the University of Michigan, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all this evening. I was excited to receive the invitation in early October to come back here to University of Michigan's campus to have this kind of discussion, but all the more so was I excited to come back the day after Michigan's amazing victory over Ohio State, which made it all the more sweeter. You know, Dan, when you first conceived this, you and Ambassador Weiser, we didn't know who was going to be the President of the United States. So the concept of developing some options for the next President of the United States happened in advance of the actual election. But this august group agreed to gather to do just that because there was a sense, and there is a sense, I think, in all parties that we are moving towards something concluding or decisive about this war. It's increasingly clear that victory will not be dictated on the battlefield, which is the antecedent to negotiations. And President-elect Trump, during his campaign, has made quite clear that negotiations will be a high priority for him to bring this war to a conclusion. In fact, he's already met with President Zelensky. He's spoken with President Putin. He's appointed a special envoy, Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, who's a fantastic choice, incidentally, a former colleague of mine in the government, a person of tremendous experience and courage, and he has the complete trust of the President of the United States, as the President-elect said when he appointed him. So the conditions are definitely present for a negotiation, and we expect that this will proceed relatively soon in the new year when the President-elect is in office. There will be one major obstacle that the new president will face, which is it does not seem to any of us at present that the Russians are prepared to negotiate. As was said today by a commentator, Mark Thiessen in the Washington Post, Russia doesn't want a negotiation. Russia wants Ukraine. And that's going to be the principal challenge that the new president is going to face, is that one of the parties is not yet prepared to negotiate, which is going to present the president with some very difficult choices on whether to increase pressure on the Russians in order to get them to the negotiating table, whether to offer them inducements, or some combination of the two. Now, our hope is that there will be a good faith negotiation between the Ukrainians and the Russians. This is not between the United States and the Russians. This is between Ukraine and Russia. Russia is the aggressor and invaded Ukraine. When those negotiations begin, there's going to be 4 major issues on the table that are going to consume the interlocutors. The first is territory. And to some extent, this will be resolved by where the lines are on the battlefield when the negotiation begins. A second, very important one, is transitional justice, accountability for the war crimes that have been committed against the Ukrainian people. A third that we discussed at length is economic reconstruction, restitution, reparations, the rebuilding of Ukraine. And the fourth, and absolutely the linchpin for any successful negotiation, security. How can Ukraine be secure at the conclusion of this war to ensure that that conclusion is simply not an interlude or a respite before Putin once again tries to overthrow the government of Ukraine and subvert Ukraine to Russian control? So when you look at our paper and the summary of our recommendations, they're very much designed to present the new president with options in a pathway for a winning strategy to end the war. To end the war in a way that secures Ukraine.
Minna, you're from Finland, and the countries in your part of Europe, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, have been accused over the years of being Russophobic, prisoners of history, overly emotional, trapped by the past. There's a long list of cliches, basically telling the countries that know Russia best that they should get over it. But Finland, and the other countries I mentioned have been proven right about Russia. You were right all along. We're all exposed to Russian aggression, but Finland and the countries in Europe's east more so. Ukraine can't be helped by the US alone. Europe's going to have to step up. So how do you see Europe backing Ukraine now with all the questions and concerns that some people have about the Trump administration, although I think Steve's spot on right about the character of General Kellogg and a lot of the foreign policy picks. How do you see Europe responding and standing up? You watched this statement take place. Finland just joined NATO, and you take security very seriously. So what's your take, both as a Finn and a European, on where we go from here?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's been a great pleasure and honor. I can just start with saying that, like, unfortunately, not everybody is as lucky as us to have a neighbor like Russia who makes it very clear where your security interests lie. So we have sort of like a more clear-eyed picture on things because of that, I believe. So geography matters in that sense. But on the other hand, geography can also change, and this is very important for Ukraine because there tends to be this idea of Ukraine being somehow between East and the West in some kind of like state of in-between, not quite part of the one, but also not part of the other. And that doesn't have to be that way. There is no like automatic sort of reason or rationale to that. Finland actually, my country, could arguably, one could argue that Finland was in a similar sort of in-between state during the Cold War. But I doubt that many people still consider Finland somehow to be in between anything. We are now a member of the EU, the European Union, and recently also joined NATO, so there's no question about any of that anymore. And this is also the future that we want to see for Ukraine. So for small countries, like Finland, like the Baltic states, also the other Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland, for small countries like ours, rules-based international order is incredibly important. A rules-based order that recognizes every state's right to exist and right to sovereignty and right to just like lead a peaceful life within the internationally recognized borders without being attacked by neighbors. This is incredibly important for all of us, and that is why it is absolutely unacceptable to us, for example, to hear suggestions that Ukraine should be banned from NATO membership. Ukraine should not have the same sovereign choice that we all had in choosing our path and our place in Europe. whether it is the European Union or NATO. So this is one very important thing. And you can also see how exactly these like Nordic and Baltic countries, for example, although it's very small countries, just to give you an idea, because like many people don't know what Finland is, for example. So Finland has a population of 5.5 million, so do also Norway and Denmark, and Sweden is somewhat bigger with 10 million, but all like fairly small countries. And nevertheless, these countries have already supported Ukraine militarily and pledged support until 2030, worth $35 billion. So this is actually more than Germany has done, for example, although Germany's GDP is 4 times the total GDP, or the combined GDP of these 4 countries. So there's a very clear sense of urgency, and also the Baltic countries were like among the first to even really heavily support Ukraine militarily. It was incredibly important that the Baltic states, also, although being even smaller than the Nordic countries, really led the way in Europe. And this has been one of the interesting sort of developments in Europe as a result of Russia's full-scale invasion, that you used to think of leadership in Europe as being this Franco-German tandem. But actually, because of various domestic unstable political situations and other troubles in the big European countries, smaller countries have taken the lead in many ways. For example, Denmark and the Netherlands led the coalition that led to the donation of F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine, to name one example. The Czech Republic was very important in sourcing ammunition for Ukraine. So small countries have really stepped up and tried to take the lead and take the initiative where the bigger countries have failed. And this is really the strength of Europe. I like to always say, I lived in Germany for a long time, so I have lots of love for Germany, but Germany is not Europe, you know? And this is something that maybe people sometimes forget in the US, that although Germany is important, Germany is not all of Europe. There's much more there, and not all German problems are European problems, and therefore I have faith in the ability and definitely the willingness of the smaller European countries to step up for Ukraine. So you see this, for example, again, if I take the example of the Nordic and Baltic countries, in long-term investments into building joint ventures in the defense industry, into investing heavily into Ukraine's own ability to build up its defense capability and defense industrial base beyond just donations, in sort of like empowering Ukraine to become sort of more self-sufficient in terms of security and defense. And also these long-term financial pledges, like take Denmark, a country with a population of 5.5 million people. They have pledged and already given $8 billion, 8.5, I think, in dollars, 8 billion euros alone. So that is like quite a massive sum for such a small country. So we are not giving up on Ukraine, no matter what. So if the US is on board, that's definitely better, but we will do it anyways. Thank you.
Thank you. Assia, full disclosure, we work together at the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm on the board. You run the programs in Europe, including in Ukraine. Now, the paper you have, the one-pager does not reflect it, but we spent a lot of time talking about Ukraine's arc of reform and national transformation. And there's a lot of discussion about that, a lot of information, a lot of bad information, cliches, and it's become politicized in the debate in Washington. So you follow Ukraine as an outsider, but a knowledgeable one. So what's your take, and what do you want people to know about where Ukraine is on this arc of transformation from post-communism, Ukraine in the 90s, to a future in the EU? And other countries have traveled along this arc successfully, who started basically a generation before Ukraine. I'm thinking of Poland, of course, but others, Lithuania. Where's Ukraine on this arc?
Thank you, Dan. This is a really essential question, because I think we can safely argue it's because of Ukraine's successful democratic transition that Russia felt so threatened and attacked Ukraine. It's because the Ukrainians, as a free nation, made a free geopolitical choice to belong to the free European family. Now, on your question of where Ukraine stands, the short answer, it's making incredibly impressive and solid progress. Let me also go back to the basics. Many countries in the situation of Ukraine who has been in a state of war since 2014 with a lot of sacrifices to the people and the economy and the political system, and under 3 years of continued shelling, many countries would have probably experienced a democratic reversal or some sort of democratic failure, right? Not Ukraine. Ukraine today has a functional check and balances system, local government bodies, delivers services, has free press. Of course, there are a million challenges, right? But it remains an unconsolidated democracy. Moreover, for the last 2 years of applying for EU membership and being granted candidacy status and starting negotiations as of this summer, Ukraine has made some impressive progress, and especially in the areas that are oftentimes the subject of conversation when it comes to democracy in Ukraine, such as corruption or judicial reform. Just to give you a few examples. Ukraine has managed to build a functional ecosystem of anti-corruption bodies, including a specialized anti-corruption court, has started high-level prosecutions of officials. We hear about these scandals because Ukraine is a democracy. It also has digitized a number of services that have curbed the opportunities for corruption and has an impressive collection of open data, searchable data for any citizens, including for court verdicts. The judiciary, which is under incredible pressure with 2,000 vacancies, 15% of the courts are closed because, you know, Ukraine's being constantly attacked, and public servant judges sometimes are at the front lines, has adopted new selection procedures for judges, new qualification procedures. Judges are being retested, reappointed. Yes, there are delays and a lot of problems. But I think this only comes to show that Ukraine is a place worthwhile of continued support and investment. And under a secure situation, I'm convinced that Ukrainian democracy will flourish because it has proven its resilience where many other countries would have failed.
And let the record show that in 2013, Ukrainians started a national protest flying the EU flag. And if you ask them why, they said it was because we want a European future for ourselves, and that means democracy, rule of law, no corruption, freedom. And I actually want to underscore your early point that that was the threat that Putin saw in Ukraine. It had nothing to do with NATO. It had to do with the spectacle of a successful democratic Ukraine as a European country, as Minister Kuleba says, returning to its European roots and showing up Russia. And Putin couldn't handle that, so he sent in the troops. Well, I am told that anybody can write a question. You use the note cards on your seats. You pass it to the staff at the end of the rows. And welcome questions on what we've talked about or anything that is on, anything on these issues on your mind. And I have to say that Minister, I want to underscore something, Minister, while we're waiting for questions, I want to underscore something Minister Kuleba said. We looked hard at the issue of Ukraine and NATO, and we discussed its pluses and minuses, and we looked at alternatives. And the alternatives all look worse. And what bothered, I think, all of us is that if we choose something lesser for Ukrainian security, the gap between NATO and whatever lesser option we choose is the gap which Putin will find tempting. And he will move into that gap, and we will have more war. Now, I'm not speaking for the group, only for myself, but we were engaged in intense discussions on this issue. And it's not an easy one. It's not a simple call. 30 years ago, when we were talking about Poland coming into NATO, we thought it was tough. It was a lot easier, because the war that Lech Wałęsa warned Bill Clinton about 30 years ago is the war that Ukraine's got right now. Václav Havel and Lech Wałęsa told Bill Clinton, you've got a window, you Americans. And if you don't take down the Iron Curtain and bring us into NATO, the Russians will be back and you will have screwed it up. They didn't put it in quite that rough language, although Lech Wałęsa kind of did, for people who know him. And that's what we were dealing with. That's the war you've got, the war of Putin's attempt to restore the Russian Empire. And the Finns know all about that, right? You were fighting off the Russians and saved your country at terrible cost. Everybody's grandfather, in your case, great-grandfather. Anyway, I wanted to underscore that because Minister Kuleba made reference to it, and that was, we had intense discussions on that issue. And we came to read our conclusions. There it is. So, happy for questions.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Good evening to the panelists. My name is Arthur Mangozzi. I'm a second-year PhD student in the Slavic Languages and Literatures Department. I had the opportunity to work at the Reckoning Project as well at Michigan, and I also teach first-year Ukrainian. So the first question is to the Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba. The question is about encountering pro-Russia or pro-Putin individuals in all your conversations in your career, and whether you're able to change their minds on the perspective of Ukraine and the West, and what strategies work for you in changing their minds. Thank you.
That must be a question coming from someone who teaches or studies negotiating practices, right? No, I didn't change anyone's mind, frankly. But the best you can get is to make them think. Because they come to a meeting with you indoctrinated, and I'm speaking about ministers, leaders, heads of government and state. And, their framework, their mindset is not coming out of the blue. It's a result of serious reflection. And I have a couple of anecdotes related to this, so I'll just give you a couple of them, which will tell you more than my dwelling on the matter. So, in one conversation with an official representative of a country that you know very well, that person told me, you know what? I lost 2/3 of the territory of my country because of the aggression of the country that stands by you and you consider your biggest ally. So why do you think I should have any sympathy to their cause, which is also your cause? Guess the country. She was speaking Spanish. And it sounded stunning because, how can you draw parallels between these things? But these deep historical feelings that hurt them, they begin to dominate their doctrine entertained today. Even the incident that we've had here. I cannot imagine a group of Ukrainian students interrupting event dedicated to Palestine and Israel and Middle East. I just cannot do that. Out of respect to the pain they are going through. And here, you know, we are all in the university, educated people, including ladies and gentlemen who sang the song. But still, it doesn't matter to them. And if we had said anything back to them, I don't think they would have really kind of changed their minds. Africa is very complicated. Africa is driven by anti-colonial historical references and the narrative that Russia never did anything bad to us, while the West did. So we sympathize you, but you know, we cannot do anything against Russia. The underlying reason for that is, of course, because they're afraid of retaliation, and of China, because they know that going against Russia means going against China, so it's a more complicated game. In one conversation with Asian foreign minister, with Southeast Asian foreign minister, he started telling me the same story that, you know, I sympathize Ukraine very much, you're very good people, we've always been friends, but the West sends you all these weapons and it just fuels the war. They must stop doing it and the war will come to an end. And then I had to challenge him. That was one of the most undiplomatic conversations I had. But I said to him, listen, if I translate what you just said from diplomatic language into human language, you basically said you want friends of Ukraine not to send weapons to Ukraine so that Russia can more easily kill all of us and take our country, and then this is it. It will be, the business will be done. So you cannot change someone's mind in one conversation. What you can do is to make person think, or if you're lucky, you can bargain one, you know, minor concession as an excuse, as it was the case in one African country, where the president was absolutely deaf to what I was saying, except that I asked him in the end, at least, you know, can you do the least and just vote in favor of the upcoming resolution in Anga? And they did nothing but voted for the resolution. But that was more like an act of mercy. So prepare for this kind of conversations. You have to really dig into history and understand the historical traumas, because as I found out, these historical references, doesn't matter how old they are, how far back in history they go, they still resonate when you speak about our contemporary times.
Hi, thank you guys for joining us today. My name is Sophia. I am a first-year JD candidate at the law school, and I received my undergrad bachelor's degree here in May. And I also had the pleasure of working with the Reckoning Project for the past 2 years. So the question that I have for you surrounds territorial integrity and how it's relayed in the proposal here. So when you refer to that territorial integrity, what is your perspective on Crimea in a future Ukraine? And this question can be answered by anybody.
I'll start. Ukraine already has internationally recognized borders, and those are and shall remain the internationally recognized border of Ukraine, despite the reality that Ukraine does not control all the territory within those borders. That is international law. That is the policy of all but a small handful of countries around the world, and this includes Crimea, which is part of Ukraine. Territorial issues will certainly be a matter of priority in the negotiations. And by the way, these territorial matters also include the Ukrainian occupation of a significant part of Russia in the region of Kursk. There will be some territorial negotiations to potentially at least swap parts of the occupied territories. But I think speaking practically and pragmatically, without the ability to resolve this conflict on the battlefield, it's unlikely that Ukraine will reacquire its lawfully entitled territories in the negotiating table either. So what do we do? How do we keep that from becoming an unsolvable obstacle to a negotiation. The U.S. has confronted this same dilemma in the three times in the past century, once with the Japanese annexation of Manchuria in 1932, the second with the Soviet annexation of the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia in 1939, and the third with Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. In all three occasions, the United States and the vast majority of nations around the world have refused to recognize the occupied territory as anything except Ukrainian territory. Even if this matter is not resolved in the negotiating table, it will hang as an unresolved issue going into the future. In 1955, the Chancellor of Germany, Konrad Adenauer, made a very difficult decision to bring his country into NATO. In 1955, West Germany joined NATO. West Germany had to concede that NATO would not have responsibilities in East Germany. Konrad Adenauer, Chancellor Adenauer, had to confront the reality that while he was protecting the free part of his country, he was potentially sacrificing the future for the part which remained occupied and under the control of the Soviet Union. But if you had told Konrad Adenauer in 1955 that 35 years later his country would be unified under democratic government and a member of NATO, protected as all other NATO members are, he would have leaped at the deal. And so this will be a challenging moment for the Ukrainian government to even accept this concession of de facto, but not de jure, Russian control of parts of Ukrainian territory. It will be a very difficult point at the negotiating table. As I mentioned, territory, transitional justice, economic recovery, and security. This will be one of the four issues, but it is one that we have a precedent on how to resolve.
Okay, so the next question is open to anyone on the panel. What will or what should the United States and NATO do to win the information war? It's a big question.
Start fighting it better. The issues of foreign information interference or disinformation have become politicized in this country, and that's unfortunate. There are ways to combat information manipulation. It starts with transparency and integrity. The European Union is far ahead of the United States in trying to come up with a way to regulate this. Regulation of online space is a dirty word in the United States, and I get it. It could easily go bad. But transparency and integrity is not the same as content control. Content control, arbiters of truth, you don't want governments being arbiters of truth, like ever. But integrity may mean that Billy Bob from Tennessee needs to be Billy Bob from Tennessee, whatever his views, and not Ivan from some troll farm. And it isn't a violation of free speech to insist that people be who they say they are. Now, that's a simple example, but it's something we need to think about. There's also, look, in the history of information revolution, there usually is a period where the technology is in advance of the culture. So the Gutenberg printing press, and we think of the Gutenberg Bible, but the Gutenberg printing press also was responsible for printing all kinds of inflammatory tracts that provoked and exacerbated the religious wars. Or newspapers, popular newspapers, yellow journalism. We adjusted to that after a while. and it took a national effort. And actually, the United States government over the past, X number of years has gotten a little better at this. We've seen evidence where disinformation operations are exposed and sometimes people brought to justice. So it's not going to be easy. There is a way to do it. Also, back in the Cold War, some of our most effective tools were Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and we need to keep funding those, and maybe and update them for the digital age. Anyway, more to say, but that's quite enough.
If I may just add, so Finland has, for example, invested a lot in the education system, in media literacy education from a very early age. So basically, that is the long and hard way to combat disinformation, because it takes time to educate people. But basically, you need to get to a point where people understand that they need multitude of sources, and then they can so this is literally a question of how you can know something. What sources are reliable? So one aspect of this is trust in authorities, whether people in a country are likely to trust official sources and authorities or not. Then it's a question of whether people understand that they need multiple sources, and then they need to base their understanding of what has happened on the sort of middle ground between those multiple sources, and not to leap on that one that says something else and claims to be the truth and that everybody else is lying. So this is, for example, one step, and this is the hard and long way. What indeed the European Union has also been doing, apart from regulation. So regulation is sort of the short-term sort of reaction that you can do, but that's not the long-term solution. But the EU has, for example, also started keeping a database of disinformation campaigns that have been identified. So calling out this kind of unauthentic behavior can also help, at least to expose the source of misinformation. But then sometimes it's just difficult. As I joked earlier, not everybody knows what Finland is, and it was quite the problem in the NATO accession process for us, for example, because misinformation, not necessarily malign disinformation, but just misinformation, would spread very easily because people had no basis to judge on whether something can or cannot be true realistically about Finland. So it's a complex process, but education is quite the key here.
Okay, we've also had a couple questions related to how nuclear weapons factor into this war. So this is kind of a two-parter. So in terms of returning nuclear weapons as a deterrent to Ukraine, whether that could be a negotiating tactic, and then on the other hand, how to secure Russian nukes.
So this conflict is already complicated enough. The last thing it needs is nuclear weapons. And it would be irresponsible, I think, for any Western policy makers to openly discuss such a prospect. We have a larger priority of maintaining the nuclear non-proliferation regime and trying to contain the spread of nuclear weapons as it stands today. And I think this would be significantly, if not deeply, destabilizing. But the real irresponsible behavior on the nuclear issues has come from Moscow, with President Putin's breach of long-held taboos to threaten the use of nuclear weapons, in this case against a non-nuclear state, and in this case in the face of reversals of his own aggressive moves through conventional weapons and the fighting spirit of the Ukrainian people. We can add this to the list of reckless, dangerous, and criminal activities that have been undertaken by President Putin. But our response is best to be undeterred and unaffected, and continue to support the policy that will deliver a free and sovereign future for the people of Ukraine within their internationally legal recognized borders.
If I may add, because if he ever does it, it's going to fall on our heads in Ukraine. So I think what Steve said is very important, because it's not based on the so-called non-escalatory logic. The nuke argument is the ultimate element in the non-escalatory strategy, which implies that we shouldn't be doing something to support Ukraine out of fear of Russian retaliation. So if we give this type of weapons to Ukraine, Russia will do something bad. If we give more weapons, Russia will do something even worse. And it's exactly this logic of non-escalation that ends with the nuke argument, which, if you kind of rewind it, brings you to a conclusion that you don't have to do anything, because if you do something, it will lead to nukes. And this is exactly the paralytical effect that Putin is looking for and masterfully plays with. The non-escalatory logic is, or strategy, is the worst after the Russian invasion of what happened to Ukraine in the last 2.5 years. If this logic did not dominate decision makers' thinking in key capitals, including Washington, many crucial decisions would have been taken on time and in full. And we would have been in a much better situation now. And we would have been discussing a slightly different agenda under the same title. So do not get overwhelmed. I mean, do not get overly focused on the issue of nukes for one simple reason, because if you do, it leads you to nowhere. Unless, as I learned, and I very much appreciate this learning exercise for me from these 2 days of conversation, from talking with our seasoned American diplomats, when you said that in the 50s and in the 60s, the United States thinking on nukes was not paralyzed by fear. And this is why you won. John, it was you, sorry. John Herbst made the point. I just want to be fair and credit him.
3 years.
Yeah, and this is exactly why you won. Because while the threat was real, you were not paralyzed by fear. And this is exactly the only logic that will help Ukraine win. Thank you.
So the next question regards the incoming administration. In your estimation, how willing will the Trump administration be to increasing US military support to Ukraine in order to drive Russia to the negotiating table?
The president has been consciously ambiguous in what exactly the details of his peace proposal are, and it's understandable in advance of beginning negotiations. His appointed representative, General Kellogg, has begun to talk in some detail, and for reference has written a recommended strategy for negotiations in his affiliation with the American First Policy Institute. And the plan is worth reading because it addresses this very issue. And one that I pointed out in my comments at the beginning is one of the central obstacles to the commencement of negotiations, which is that Russia doesn't want negotiations, Russia wants Ukraine. In that instance, what at least has been suggested by those who will be steering this process for the new administration, the president should look at increasing the pressure on Russia. That if Russia feels that its interests are better pursued on the battlefield, then those realities have to change in a substantial way in order to encourage Russia to understand that its interests are better pursued at the negotiating table. And so I think to this question, the answer is that if President Putin in fact misplays his hand, and already he seems to be, already senior Russian government officials have rejected the very notion that negotiations will be a path forward to end this war. President Putin could find in President Trump a very formidable adversary, and one that he will regret having crossed, I believe, if he does so.
Let me add something. I'm not part of Trump world, but I'm in profound agreement with what Steve Biegun said. there have been a lot of remarks and speculations out of the Trump-aligned world that give me a great deal of pause or even alarm. But if you look at the people appointed to the responsible positions in the future Trump administration, listen to what they say and listen to what they've written, the question I've asked myself is, can a good outcome be built on the framework of this policy that they have sketched out? It's only a sketch, nothing more. But is there potential in that sketch for a good outcome? And my answer is yes. There is. Doesn't mean it'll happen. It means it could happen. And Steve was sort of outlining one of the ways it could happen. So, you know, my answer is there's potential here for a good outcome. And as someone who served different administrations over many years of different political parties, I am much less interested in the partisanship and much more interested in whether a good outcome can be achieved from the framework that an incoming administration lays out. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but the potential for a good outcome is here, I'm convinced.
Okay, the next question. Oh, sorry. The next question. Is this? Okay, it is. I'm just a little short. The next question I have has to do with peace negotiations and regarding specifically what lessons has Ukraine learned from the experience of the Budapest Memorandum, and how will these lessons impact the upcoming peace negotiations?
I'm sorry to say this in the United States, but when two most important countries for you, the United States and Russia, conspire behind your back to strip you of nuclear weapons, there is very little you can do. And of course, I can say now, looking back, that it was a big mistake and we should have opposed it and we should have chosen the path of pariah instead of giving it up. But you know, Clinton called Yeltsin, and Yeltsin called Clinton, and they were literally discussing how to corner Kravchuk and how to make him sign the paper. So the lesson from Budapest Memorandum is something that you should learn. And that lesson is stop looking at Ukraine through Russian eyeglasses. You never believed in us, starting with George Bush, who came to Kiev 3 weeks before Ukraine declared independence and urged Ukrainians not to declare independence. The Europeans, by the way, were the same, so no worries, you're not alone. So the moment you stop looking at Ukraine through Moscow, and I think it's an important deliverable of our our work, that we had kind of a direct line between Washington and Ukraine. Such tragic mistakes as Budapest Memorandum will not be repeated. The lesson of negotiations and how to handle peace process. I would like to remind everyone that the very first format of negotiations in 2014, the so-called Geneva format, had the United States in the group, I mean, at the table. Then the United States decided to drop out and delegate it to Germany and France. It didn't mean that Washington was completely out of the game, of course, but they were playing a very active role, an important role. But having two intermediaries in talks, one of whom adores Dostoevsky, Russian ballet, and everything related to Russian culture, and another one builds Nord Stream 2 and cannot imagine itself without Russian money, these are not fair negotiations, by definition. And it doesn't matter how many times these people will say that they respect territorial integrity of Ukraine and they will never compromise on principles. By definition, this is not a fair game. and you end up in a much worse position than you were. Chancellor Merkel can say many things now. Of course, she has to defend her line. That's absolutely clear. History will judge her. I think it already does. But the lesson we learned is that negotiating process should be structured in a way where those who will be in between Russia and Ukraine will not be acting in a way that allows Russia to benefit more than Ukraine. This is the fundamental rule that we learned with our blood and sweat.
Let me add one element here, which is that any peace negotiation or peace settlement should correspond to a degree to the big expectations of the Ukrainian public, the Ukrainian people. They have agency. And Ukraine has the most powerful, experienced army in Europe. And these are angry people as well. And so any peace negotiations should have in mind the impact that this would have on the future of Ukraine, on its stability, on its democracy, and on its sustainability.
I want to add something about the Budapest Memorandum, because I was in Budapest in December 1994 when it was signed. And I'll say this. We messed that up. There were reasons. Okay, we had reasons, and I could give you them now, but I won't. But I'll say this because we're at a university. I'm old enough to have seen a lot of policies that worked out and a lot of policies that didn't. And if you're in policy making or around it long enough, things will go wrong. You will make mistakes. Your government will make mistakes. You'll make them personally. And the rule can't be perfection because that's not achievable. But one rule that is realizable is don't screw it up the same way twice. Okay? Right? So, yeah. And, and don't get defensive. Okay, cue me to give 10 minutes of reasons why Bill Clinton did what he did. I get that. All good reasons, but the result was bad. So don't get defensive. Learn from the screw up. Don't make it again. And there are profound lessons there if you can actually stand up and recognize when you messed it up.
Time for one more question. Many wonderful questions from the field. As you mentioned, Foreign Minister Kuleba, the future of Ukraine is indeed bright, and essential to that future is rebuilding. The question is, how can we help Ukraine rebuild?
I will not. I want other colleagues to make their contributions. Believe in Ukraine. Because if you're a politician, if you're a businessman, investor, or someone running program to support small and medium businesses, if you believe in Ukraine, you will find a way how to help Ukraine recover from the war. If you don't, you will follow the war in the newspapers.
I would just like to emphasize again this positive example of this is maybe just one area, for example, the defense industry, but there's a lot of interest in investing in the Ukrainian defense industry, creating businesses together, starting co-production and so on between, for example, the Nordic countries and Ukraine. There's also been massive interest, for example, in Finland, among companies and businesses to help Ukraine and to find ways to also help Ukrainian businesses and again create those links. And at one point in 2022 and 2023, there was actually this problem that so many Finnish towns wanted some kind of partnership with Ukrainian towns that they were like, sorry, we already have 15 of these, so we don't have any capacity for more friendships. So I think that there has been a lot of positive interest in precisely this, actually.
Let me add here that Ukraine is not Iraq, it's not Afghanistan. It's a modern, advanced nation with a lot of local expertise. So I would just caution against these big international projects that are not always efficient, but investing in Ukrainians and their expertise with the proper oversight. One doesn't want to feed corruption, right? Financial resources, technical expertise, and as Minister Kuleba said, faith in Ukraine. But in addition, Ukraine has signed up for EU membership. So there's a roadmap which is clearly spelled out. And so the Europeans can play a key role here with US support to advance Ukraine's EU aspiration. And that includes a variety of sectors.
Ukraine has the richest agricultural land in the Northern Hemisphere. If you've ever seen the Black Earth region, it's stunning to see the depth of and the richness of the soils. And it's for that reason that it's the breadbasket of the world. Ukraine has trillions of dollars of mineral wealth buried beneath its ground, waiting to be extracted and created into modern machines and new technology, to new buildings, to the roads and rails that will be rebuilt in Ukraine. Western investors will see Ukraine not just as a project, but as an opportunity. But none of this future happens if Russia's aims are not defeated. Russia's desire to subvert Ukraine will condemn the people of Ukraine to an impoverished future. And the peace will not be sustained without security. And without that security, the investors and the developers and the builders and the farmers will not be able to return to their trades and occupations. We need peace, we need security, and we will see a beautiful Ukraine flourish.
I want to thank our speakers tonight and everyone, for being here tonight. It means a lot. And thank you for your patience during the minor interruption. And we continue to be with Ukraine. Thank you.